Ambrose Powell Hill was dead before April 2, 1865. Not literally, not yet, but the man who rode out into the breaking Confederate lines that Sunday morning with a single aide at his side was not the same officer who had driven his light division through the fields at Antietam in the autumn of 1862 and saved Robert E. Lee's army from destruction. That man had been lean and fierce and electric, the kind of commander whose presence alone changed what soldiers believed they were capable of. The man who rode toward the Union breakthrough at Petersburg was gaunt, hollow-eyed, and had been ill, chronically, seriously, debilitatingly ill for most of the 3 years in between. The 2 Union privates who shot Hill in the final minutes of his life did not know any of this. They were simply trying to survive a morning that had gone loud and violent and confusing in the dark before dawn. But the bullet that stopped A.P. Hill's heart on April 2nd was not the first thing that had been killing him. It was just the last. That distinction matters more than most Shiloh accounts of his death have been willing to examine. Hill's illness has been part of the historical record for a long time, mentioned in biographies with varying degrees of frankness and usually passed over quickly in broader Civil War histories. What it actually meant to his performance, to his psychology, and ultimately to the manner in which he chose to die has received considerably less attention. The condition most historians now attribute to him is chronic prostatitis, the legacy of a gonorrheal infection contracted during his time at West Point in the late 1840s. It is the kind of detail that polite 19th century biography found ways to omit, and its omission has distorted the story of one of the Confederate Army's most important officers. The illness was not occasional. It was not a periodic inconvenience that flared up in unfortunate moments. By the middle of the war, it had become a defining feature of Hill's existence, something he managed around, fought through, and was gradually losing ground to. He missed Antietam for the first portion of the battle, finally arriving with his division after a legendary 17-mile march from Harper's Ferry. He was ill before Jackson's flank attack at Chancellorsville. During the Gettysburg campaign, his health was questionable enough that men in his command noticed the difference in how he operated. By the last winter of the war, outside Petersburg, the physical deterioration had become visible to anyone who spent time around him. Officers who had known Hill since the war's early years reported being shaken by his appearance. What the illness was doing to him internally, to his energy, to his decision-making, to the capacity for the relentless mental and physical engagement that Corps Command demanded, can only be inferred from the record, but the inference is not a difficult one. Chronic pain at that level, sustained over years without adequate treatment, without rest, without the basic conditions that allow a human body to stabilize, changes a person.
It does not always make them less brave or less committed. Sometimes it makes them more reckless because the calculation of personal risk shifts when the body is already extracting its own cost every day, regardless of what you do. That shift may explain a great deal about the morning of April 2nd. The context of that morning requires the night that preceded it. On April 1, 1865, Philip Sheridan's Union cavalry and infantry shattered the Confederate right flank at Five Forks, a road junction southwest of Petersburg that Lee had called the last line his army could not afford to lose. The Confederate force under George Pickett was effectively destroyed as a fighting unit. Pickett himself was not present when the battle started. He had been at a shadbake behind the lines, a detail that history has not been kind to him about. And by the time the full weight of Sheridan's assault landed, there was nothing left to organize a defense with. Five Forks was not just a defeat, it was the unraveling of the last viable defensive geometry around Petersburg. Every calculation Lee had been making about time and supply lines and the possibility of joining Johnston in North Carolina was suddenly recalibrated in the span of an afternoon. Lee understood what Five Forks meant. Grant understood it too, and before midnight on April 1st, he ordered a general assault along the entire Petersburg line for the following morning. For 9.5 months, Grant's army had been slowly strangling the Confederate defenses, extending the lines further and further west, stretching Lee's thinning army past the point where any stretch of the perimeter was adequately held. Petersburg had been under siege since the previous June. The men in the Confederate trenches were hungry, exhausted, and had been watching their numbers dwindle through desertion and disease for months. They were soldiers in name and in the facts of their service record. In terms of what they had left to give, the question was genuinely open. A.P. Hill had been at his headquarters in the Widow Knight house that evening, ill enough that he had spent part of the day in bed. When reports began coming in about Five Forks, he rode to confer with Lee at Edge Hill, the house where Lee had been using as his Petersburg headquarters. The two men had been together through everything the Army of Northern Virginia had experienced since the spring of 1962. Hill had commanded Lee's most aggressive division, then his most aggressive corps. Lee trusted him. He also worried about him, and had been worrying about him more as the winter stretched toward spring, and Hill's physical condition continued its visible decline. What was said between them that night is not fully recorded. What is known is that Hill returned to his headquarters and that both men understood the Army's situation was critical. The question was no longer whether Petersburg could be held indefinitely. That question had been settled. The question was whether the Army could extract itself from the lines in time to move south and link up with Joseph Johnston in North Carolina. That plan, tenuous as it was what Lee was working toward. It required days he might not have.
At approximately 4:40 in the morning on April 2nd, the Union 6th Corps under Horatio Wright broke through the Confederate lines at a point southwest of Petersburg. The breakthrough was real, and it was wide. Union soldiers poured through the gap and began spreading out behind the Confederate defensive works, cutting off units, capturing men, moving toward the city itself. The Confederate position was fragmenting. Hill was awakened by the sounds of artillery and musketry coming from directions that made no sense if the lines were intact. He dressed quickly and rode to Lee's headquarters, arriving to find Lee already dealing with reports that were uniformly bad. The two men consulted. Then Hill, in what would be his last independent decision of his life, rode west toward the break in the lines, with only his aide, Sergeant George Tucker, beside him. This is the moment the narrative always rushes past. Two men riding toward a Union breakthrough. Hill's stated intention was to find his corps, to assess the situation on the ground himself, to do what a corps commander does when the lines are collapsing. That explanation is procedurally correct and humanly incomplete. Hill had ridden into dangerous ground alone or nearly alone before. It was a habit that had alarmed his staff throughout the war. Some commanders managed risk by staying back. Hill managed it by going forward, by seeing things personally, by not waiting for information to filter back through layers of staff. That was part of who he was as an officer, and it was a quality that Lee valued, even when it made everyone nervous. But April 2nd was different. The lines had not just been probed, they had been penetrated by a force that was, at that moment, spreading through the rear areas in significant numbers. Riding west toward the break with one companion was not an act of battlefield reconnaissance. It was riding into the middle of an enemy breakthrough with nothing to protect you. Tucker apparently understood this. By some accounts, he was not sanguine about the situation and made it known. Hill pressed on. They encountered two Union soldiers moving through the woods, Corporal John Mauck and Private Daniel Wolford of the 138th Pennsylvania Infantry, men who had come through the break in the lines and were working their way through terrain they didn't fully know, alert to the presence of Confederate forces. When Hill and Tucker came upon them, Hill was still in the mindset of a senior officer assessing a situation. He ordered Tucker to call for the men's surrender. Mauck and Wolford refused. The accounts of the next few seconds vary in minor details, but agree on the essential facts. Shots were fired. A.P. Hill was hit. The bullet entered through his raised left hand. He may have had it up in the gesture of a man calling for surrender or a man about to speak, and traveled through his arm and into his chest, where it stopped his heart almost immediately. He was dead before he could have fully registered what had happened. Tucker, miraculously unhurt, escaped back toward Confederate lines to report. He was 39 years old. He had been at war for nearly 4 years. He left behind a wife, Kitty, the sister of Confederate cavalry raider John Hunt Morgan, and 2 daughters. His body was found by Confederate soldiers who recognized him and brought him back. When the news reached Lee, the general's response was brief and has been repeated often enough that it risks losing its weight. He said, "He is at rest now, and we who are left are the ones to suffer." That sentence has usually been read as an expression of grief. It is that, certainly, but it is also something else. Lee knew about Hill's illness. He knew what the last years had cost him physically. The phrase, "he is at rest now," carries a specific meaning when spoken about a man whose body had been at war with itself for years before the actual war's conclusion ended both conflicts simultaneously. Lee was not just saying Hill was dead, he was saying Hill was no longer in pain. Whether Hill wanted it that way is the question that sits underneath everything about the morning of April 2nd and refuses to be easily answered. He could not have failed to understand, riding out of Lee's headquarters that morning, that the army was finished. 9.5 months of siege had ended in a breakthrough that was visible and audible from the headquarters itself. The plan to link up with Johnston was a hope, not a certainty, and Hill was experienced enough to assess hopes honestly. The Confederacy he had spent his health fighting for was collapsing in real time. The men of his corps, the soldiers he had commanded, driven, protected, and led since 1862, were being captured or killed or scattered across the broken landscapes south of Petersburg. Everything he had given the last 4 years to was ending badly on a Sunday morning in April, and he rode toward it anyway, with one man, toward a Union breakthrough, with no plan that had any realistic chance of changing the situation. There is a word for that category of action, and it is not the same word as courage, though it sometimes wears courage's clothing. Men who are exhausted beyond recovery, who are in chronic pain, who have watched everything they believed in disintegrate. Men in that condition sometimes make decisions that look like bravery from the outside and feel from the inside more like an answer to a question they have already stopped asking. Whether A.P. Hill consciously chose to die on April 2nd is not something any historian can state as a fact. What can be said is that the circumstances of his death bear the marks of a man who placed no particular premium on surviving it. He did not take a larger escort. He did not wait for information before moving toward an active breakthrough. He did not, by any account of those final minutes, behave like a man who expected or particularly required the morning to go well for him personally. The Confederate command absorbed his death on a day when there were almost no good things to absorb. Petersburg fell that afternoon. Richmond was evacuated that night. Lee's army moved west, and the week that followed brought it to a crossroads at Appomattox Courthouse, where the final chapter was written with a kind of quiet that felt obscene after 4 years of noise. Hill missed all of it, which was arguably the most merciful outcome available. The 2 Union soldiers who shot him, Mauck and Wolford, were not celebrated in the way that men who kill famous generals sometimes are. They were ordinary infantry soldiers who had survived a morning of intense and disorienting combat and encountered a Confederate officer in the woods. They made the decision that soldiers in their situation are supposed to make. Mauck would later report the encounter in the flat procedural language of a military after-action account, describing where they were, what they saw, what Hill said, and what they did. The account is credible and contains nothing that looks like invention. That Mauck and Wolford were killing one of the most consequential officers in Lee's army was not something they knew in the moment, and the randomness of it is one of the things that has made Hill's death so difficult to fully absorb into the standard narratives. It was not a dramatic last stand. It was not a final defiant charge. It was 2 men in a wood, a refused demand for surrender, and a bullet with enough velocity to reach a heart. What Hill carried to that moment is the larger story.
the illness that had shadowed him since West Point, the fierce, costly years commanding the Light Division through every major engagement in the Eastern Theater, the complicated relationships with Jackson, who had him arrested twice during the Shenandoah Valley campaign in disputes over march order and military courtesy, and with whom Hill's animosity never fully resolved. Jackson was killed at Chancellorsville before the two men could find whatever reckoning their conflict required. The promotion to Corps Command that had gone better in some campaigns than others, the grinding responsibility of holding a section of the Petersburg lines with men and supplies that were never adequate, the slow physical deterioration visible in his face by the winter of 1864-1865. What gets obscured by the circumstances of his death is how much of himself Hill had already given before that morning. The illness alone, managing Corps-level command through chronic pain over 3 years of campaign, represents a category of sustained effort that rarely gets acknowledged because it is not the kind of effort that shows up dramatically in battle reports. It shows up instead in the gaps, in the moments when the historical record notes that Hill was ill and a subordinate assumed temporary command, in the pattern of a man perpetually operating at a deficit and somehow still operating. He had been living with an ending for years. April 2nd just brought it to the surface. Lee's army struggled on for another week after Petersburg fell, fighting smaller engagements at Sailor's Creek and elsewhere, the remnants of what had once been one of the most formidable armies in American military history, reduced to a column of hungry, exhausted men moving west toward a relief that was never going to materialize. When Lee met Grant at Appomattox, the Army of Northern Virginia had fewer than 28,000 men present for duty. The army that Hill had been part of building, the army that had fought McClellan to a standstill on the peninsula, that had smashed Pope at Second Bull Run, that had stunned the Army of the Potomac at Fredericksburg and Chancellorsville, was surrendered in a quiet parlor on a spring afternoon. Hill was buried twice. His body was first interred in Richmond, then moved to a monument at the intersection of Laburnum Avenue and Hermitage Road in Richmond, where it rests beneath a column with his statue on top, overlooking what became one of the busiest intersections in the city. It is not the most peaceful place for a man who his wife said deserved rest. But it is, in its way, appropriate. Hill spent his entire adult life in the middle of things that were moving fast and loud around him, and the intersection has that quality at least. The dark truth about A.P. Hill's final hours is not that he was killed by enemy soldiers in a war. Men died that way every day for 4 years, most of them with no monument and no column, and no historical record that preserved their names. The dark truth is everything that preceded those final minutes. The years of managed illness, the quiet erosion of a body that was fighting 2 wars simultaneously. The September morning in 1862 when he had saved Lee's army at Antietam, and the April morning in 1865 when there was nothing left to save. He rode out alone because he was the kind of man who rode out alone. But something in the manner of it, the single aide, the refusal to wait, the direction he chose, suggests he also rode out knowing what was waiting, not welcoming it necessarily, but no longer working very hard to avoid it either. That is the darkest truth the record offers, and it is one the monument on Laburnum Avenue cannot quite contain.